Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. It's really good to see you. Today we're going to be looking at... Oh, I need to look into the camera. Well, I don't know if I want to today, because it's always a bit of effort. Anyway, who cares? I want to continue with an exploration of the linguistic typology that I've been sketching in recent videos. Now, the first formal episode of linguistic typology was named Direction of Fit. Direction of Fit, and you know, given the somewhat technical nature of the discussion, I expected, you know, there to be little feedback and maybe not a lot of views, and I've been pleasantly surprised. You know, like the video has generated some interest, so it's exciting to move forward. And there's been a number of, you know, interesting comments, some interesting objections as well. You know, maybe not objections to the entire concept of direction of fit, but objections to parts of it, you know, and that's always good, because in seeking to address the objections, well, one improves. So I want to make a video soon where I address some of the most salient objections, it seems to me, that I have received in that discussion. But until then, at least for the moment, I want to explore another concept of linguistic type. And I think that once we have these two broad concepts, then maybe we can return to addressing the objections to direction of fit, and possibly likely objections to this new concept, which I'm going to discuss today. In this particular episode, I would like to discuss not statements of judgment, but rather statements of perception. And in the case of judgments of perception, I'm not going to be interested in distinguishing, let's say, between PI and PE, somewhat like I did in the case of statements of judgments, you know, where I contrasted TI with TE. In the case of statements of perception, I want to distinguish, broadly speaking, the and statements versus the S statements. Okay, so it's slightly different, right? I'm talking about statements of perception where I'm talking, broadly speaking, so far anyway, about the and statements versus the S statements. So you could call those statements of intuition versus statements of sensations. How does intuition come across in our language, and how does sensation come across in our language? Now, the concepts that I want to discuss today are the following. Concept of symmetry, which is a concept that will apply in the case of statements of sensation, and the concept of isomorphism, which will apply in the case of statements of intuition. Okay, isomorphism. Symmetry for sensation, isomorphism for intuition. And of course, I'm going to go into a bit of detail as regards what these concepts mean. But before I proceed to exploring these concepts and hopefully giving some examples as well, because that's always quite useful to concretize, you know, what I'm talking about, I wanted to add a proviso or a specification to something that, you know, it actually wasn't voiced as an objection by viewers, but it's an obvious objection to me, not to the theory, but which is in any case a pre-theory, but to the formulation I've made of it, to the presentation I've made of it so far in these videos. And that's simply that, do statements of judgment really exist? I mean, yeah, I gave an example last week in my video where, you know, I talked about Paris is a beautiful city on the one hand for statements of introverted judgment, and then, you need to come to work earlier so as to be more productive and have more sales, as a statements of extroverted judgments. But in reality, you could argue that a lot of the examples we may be tempted to provide in a video like this are somewhat artificial. In our natural language, in the language that we speak in everyday conversation, in written form or in spoken form, a lot of the time, the majority of the time, something which will immediately strike you, I think, as common sense. Our statements are mixes. There's no pure, in practice, there's no pure statements of like introverted thinking. You look at a particular proposition, sentence, and you're like, oh yeah, that's TI at work. It's like, yeah, you can see some TI, but we don't operate in the world by moving from one situation to the next, whereas like in this situation, I'm using like JI. In this next situation, I'm going to be using NE. In this other situation, I'm going to be using FE. We're always, our cognitive apparatuses are integrated frameworks. They're not just this additive kind of framework where in this situation, you use that function, in this other situation, you use that other function. It can be useful when someone is presenting the theory to try to isolate examples where the focus is entirely on JI or entirely on JE or entirely on PE or PI. But in practice, just in the same way that our mental states, our intentions, our actions are going to be interlaced and interwoven layers of PE, PI, and JE, JI, because we have those four functions, all of us do. Well, if the hypothesis that our language is a reflection of the contents of our mind or something like this, or a mediation of the interaction between our minds and the world, well, then obviously our language is always also going to reflect this interweaving of different layers. So in other words, it's going to be much more common to have a proposition or a sentence, same thing. Remember, proposition is just a formal concept for a sentence, where you'll have not just, let's say, an instance of JI used, which is maybe the dominant one, but also an instance of PE used, right? So you have both. And in fact, if you extend the single sentence to the paragraph or to the text or to the discourse, obviously what you'll notice is instances of an interweaving of the four different functions at different levels of, if you like, conspicuousness, which one is dominant, which one is more in the background, and so on. And keeping in mind that when a function is dominant, it may actually appear to be in the background, but if it's constantly structuring your language, it may still be the dominant one, even if it's not the most obvious one in terms of particular structures that are immediately jumping at you in terms of, you're just looking at the sentence. So now that point has been made, let me move on then to the more conceptual aspect. So last week we talked about direction of fit. And just as a brief reminder, I proposed the hypothesis that statements which incorporates strong elements of introverted judgment are going to be statements which are true just in case the content of the statement corresponds to the world as it is. Okay? I call this a mind-to-world direction of fit. It's your contents of your mind as expressed in your language which have to fit the reality of the external world. In the case of statements of extroverted judgment, or if I want to be more precise, again, a statement where extroverted judgment is very dominant. Now, the truth conditions of that particular statement will be, in some sense, the reverse. It will be true just in case the world is changed, the world fits the content of your mind. Usually that involves, cause and effect, a change in order to fit the contents of your mind, which is also a nice way to illustrate how strong JE users are often seen as more decisive. They change the world to fit the contents of their mind. Their mind has something in mind, indeed, and they're like, let's change the word so that it fits. Whereas the JI user is much more likely to be like, the word is like this, I want to have the most accurate and precise and clear description of it possible, and conception and explanation. So on the one hand, you have action and results. On the other hand, the emphasis is less on action and results and more on precision and clarity. And I think this makes some good intuitive sense if you think about it. Now, in the case of perception, situation is different, because in the case of perception, we're not going to be directly concerned with whether or not statements of perception are true or not. That is, we're not going to think directly of the truth conditions of statements of perception. We are going to remain focused on the idea that to think of truth conditions as mind to world or world to mind is to think in terms of judgment. Okay, JI or JE, truth conditions, mind to world or world to mind. In order to bring perception into the picture, we have to think that there is this interweaving of different layers, and that a statement of judgment is always in some way or other going to be accompanied by a statement of perception. Or to be more precise, a statement of judgment is also a statement of perception. So it's a statement of judgment perception. And that is in itself a concept which it would be very useful for people to have and to incorporate and to make natural, to naturalize within their language and their use of vocabulary and words when they're discussing typology. So if we focus here on the case of linguistic typology, we should always try to think ideally not of statements of judgment as such or statements of perception, but always as statements of judgment perception, okay, or statements of perception judgment. It's always a combination of both, and of course the judgment and the perception, they come in two variants, the extroverted and introverted. What matters is which one is dominant. So let's consider that perception, and here we want to isolate S versus N, they have an impact on the statement of judgment. So we can remain interested in our JI judgments and our JE judgments. Okay, like we can remain interested in those. That's not a problem. And perhaps what we're going to do is that we are going to remain interested specifically in this case in maybe we're going to remain interested in our JI judgments, right? So you remember the example I gave in the previous video, somewhat artificially simple example, Paris a beautiful city, JI statement, JI judgment. How does perception come into play? Specifically whether the function is an N function or an S function. We'll worry later about, in a later video, about specifying whether it's NENI or SESI. Well, this is where symmetry and isomorphism come into the picture. You have to think that when a statement of introverted judgment is true, right? So the statement of introverted judgment, first of all, is mind to world. So it has to fit the contents of the external world. It's your mind that has to adapt. So Paris is a beautiful city, just in case Paris is a beautiful city. But there are going to be a lot of cases where the statements of introverted judgment is going to be true depending not just on whether the contents of your mind fit the contents of the external world, but also according to, if you like, a regulatory framework governs by sensation. In this case, we have the symmetry, truth by symmetry, or governs by intuition, in which case we have truth by isomorphism. Truth by symmetry is kind of more straightforward, so we can focus on that first. If I say, I saw the Eiffel Tower and it was very tall, right? It's a vague statement, it's not an ideal statement, but again, the advantage is simplicity, right? Or if it was 300 meters tall, something like that, right? So again, it's a statement of introverted judgment. At least introverted judgment is an element of the statement. We want to see if it is being accompanied by this kind of implicit subterranean layer of either sensation or intuition. What I want to propose is that this JI statement is actually a JI statement which is backed up by sensation and not by intuition. And the reason why it's backed up by sensation and not by intuition is that it is true just in case there is a symmetry between the content of your sentence, the content of your proposition. The Eiffel Tower is worth 300 meters tall, and the reality of the external world. Because in fact, the Eiffel Tower is more or less 300 meters tall. So if you like, you can picture the Eiffel Tower as a state of affairs in the world, right? It's a situation. It's a state of affairs. The Eiffel Tower is this object, and it has these different properties. And you can imagine the Eiffel Tower is being a state of affairs, which is a particular structure, and the different properties as being this bundle of like this compound. You know, if you like, it's a compound of different properties. Your statement of introverted judgment is going to be true if it fits the content of that bundle of properties, in case the linguistic articulation in words is a symmetrical rendition or a symmetrical representation of what you're talking about. So if you say I saw the Eiffel Tower and it was 150 meters tall, now this statement is false because it fails to correctly represent reality. It fails to correctly fit the Eiffel Tower, but it also fails to represent it by failing the symmetry test. So it's if you like, in a statement that is undergirded by sensation, you have something that's sometimes is referred to as S-literalism. You're not going for imagistic language, metaphorical language, language that looks almost more like a painting than like an actual perfect translation. So if the content of your sentence, the content of your judgment is such that its articulation is meant as a direct copy, in some sense, a mental copy of the external situation, then it's undergirded by sensation. It will be true if the internal structure of that copy corresponds to the structure properties of the external situation, and it will be false if it fails to correspond. In the case of a statement of introverted judgments that is undergirded by intuition, we're not going to be assessing whether it is true or false exactly on the same grounds. And it's important to keep that in mind, because otherwise someone who is very much driven by sensation, someone who's a sensing type, an S-type in other words, might think that most of what an N-type says is false or doesn't make any sense. And you see that in reality, right? Sometimes people who are very literal, people who are very down to earth and practical, no bullshit type people, no nonsense, they might think that a pure N-type is, to the extent that exists, is talking mostly nonsense, particularly if they're talking about philosophy. But if you're talking to someone, so if that same N-type is addressing another strong N-type, they will not think that that person is talking a bunch of nonsense. So how do you explain this? Well, linguistic type suggests that an explanation could be provided in terms of the truth regime of the direction of fit. So if you have a direction of fit that's JI, direction of fit, mind to world, in the case of JI undergirded by intuition, of course the contents of the mind has to fit the external reality of the world. So in this case, we're still talking about the Eiffel Tower. But if I were to give, again, a somewhat artificial example, just to really illustrate what a pure statement of, that's of pure undergirded intuition would say, it would be something like, I saw the Eiffel Tower yesterday, and it was kind of like the skeleton of a skyscraper, right? The skeleton of a skyscraper. You just say the sentence, right? Now, you're not going to find a lot of help if you try to determine whether it is true or not on the basis of symmetry. Because if you think about it on the basis of symmetry, with the structure of this compound that is a bundle of properties, namely the state of affairs Eiffel Tower, it's facts, right? So it's like 300 meters tall, it's made of that material, it's in that location, its age is X hundred years old, it was designed by Gustave Eiffel, and so on. You're never going to have in your list of factual properties of the Eiffel Tower that it is a skeleton and that it corresponds in any way to a skyscraper. You're going to be like, no, a skeleton is like, you know, and you point at certain skeletons that you can see like in a museum, or a human being's skeleton, and you think of skyscrapers, you point out, you know, the Empire State Building or skyscrapers in your city or in China. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and that's because it's not, for that reason, it doesn't mean that the statement is false. Otherwise, statements of introverted judgment backed up by intuition are always going to be considered false. So what we have to consider is whether there's isomorphism between the contents of the mind, in this case, the skeleton of a skyscraper, and the actual state of affairs. So the state of affairs is always, to some extent, going to be something factual. It's a bundle of properties. The isomorphism is saying, skeleton, does that correspond to anything? It doesn't symmetrically represent the state of affairs because it's not a skeleton. But there's an isomorphism in the sense that, yeah, skeleton means just metal, and it's a very, there's this bareness to it, and there's a lot of emptiness, empty space inside it. You know, it's not this big sort of block. It's more like a skeleton. It's a skeletal structure. So in some sense, there is this isomorphism going on in this case. And skyscraper, isomorphism, why? Because a skyscraper is defined by the fact it's very tall. In fact, a lot of skyscrapers are defined as skyscrapers just in case they're maybe taller than 250 meters, let's say. So in this case, there is isomorphism between the height of the skyscraper and the height of the Eiffel Tower. And so in some sense, the structure and the content of the statement that refers to the Eiffel Tower as a skeleton and as a skyscraper, the skeleton of a skyscraper, it's not symmetrically corresponding to the external state of affairs, but isomorphically through the correspondence informed by metaphor between skeleton and the structure of the edifice Eiffel Tower and the height by reference to the skyscraper, this isomorphic reference. It's very important to distinguish between symmetrical truth, which is true of sensation, and isomorphic truth, which is true of intuition. Because if you don't differentiate between these two, you'll always have either a standpoint of a sensation which considers that all the statements of judgment backed by intuition are either nonsensical or false, and vice versa for intuition, which will see all the statements of sensations are either nonsensical, false, or maybe exaggeratedly simple, basic, or literal. And to see a very interesting illustration of the difference, and maybe in a further video at some point I'll discuss this. Literature is a great example, because you can take someone like Hemingway, who is full of statements of introverted judgment backed up by sensation, right? He's very, very developed extroverted sensation in this case. And then you can compare him with someone like Edgar Allan Poe, who's full of statements of introverted judgment also, and FI in this case, backed up by intuition, not by sensation. And you see the difference. And it doesn't make sense to say which one is truer, which one is more false. It's all a matter of the particular regime that governs the direction of fit. Is it a symmetrical regime, or is it an isomorphic regime? And let me know in the comments what you think in this video, guys. And I'm really, really looking forward to it. And hopefully, once we've managed to kind of clarify direction of fit, isomorphism, symmetry, and we start to have our concepts for the various cognitive functions and how they are manifested in our language, we can start to combine the two more and more and see what a natural language of a particular type might look like. All right, I'll see you soon, guys. Take care.